Welcome to Adeptus On-Air, the show where we examine how individuals and companies make decisions that drive their business and personal success. Each week, we connect with notable professionals who pull back the curtain on the industries that Adeptus has been on the cutting edge of for the last 30 years, including music, sports, and entertainment, as well as new emerging markets.
Welcome to Adeptus On-Air. I am your host, Evan Eneman, and we are here today with Ed Lerner. Welcome.
Hi, Evan. I'm pleased to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. So why don't we have you give a brief background on your experience, both as a writer and prior to being a full-time writer?
Okay. By training, I'm a physicist and a computer engineer, and I worked in those areas as Ed Lerner for about 30 years. As an author, I write as Edward M. Lerner, M as in Mark. At this point in my writing career, it's full-time work, and my 25th novel came out just last month, and that is Life and Death on Mars. People characterize my writing as being in the tradition of Heinlein and Asimov, but I've also partnered with Larry Niven. We did 5 books together. So it's been a varied writing career and a lot of fun, and it'll be fun to talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on all of that, especially the most recent book. Let me go back to the start when you started your career as a physicist engineer, working in these industries. How long were you working in sort of industry before you became a full-time writer?
I worked in industry full-time for about 25 years.
Right.
And at that point, I gave myself a sabbatical and tried out the whole writing gig. And that was the point at which what had been a hobby started to look very promising. So after 25 years, I'd sold 1 novel and several shorter works. I had high hopes of making the transition to full-time writing then, but the internet bubble burst, and that raised some complications. So I went back into industry for about another 5 years. In 2004, I sold my second novel, which meant the first one wasn't a fluke. That's when I went full-time.
Got it. So that was the indication to you. You sold a novel, maybe, someone had an off day and they bought it, but then the second one means that there's something there. There's a real pathway there for you.
Yeah. Now, if I were going to be really rigorous, once is random, twice can be a coincidence. It's not a pattern until 3. But after, at that point, 30 years working in industry, as much as I'd enjoyed my varied career in industry, I was ready to do something new.
Yeah.
And so I took the plunge, risking that 2 books was just a coincidence. And no, it was a pattern.
And how was that experience for you? I mean, obviously looking back now, the hindsight is you made the right choice, but obviously venturing into a new career is never an easy decision, especially when you've had such longevity in what you were originally working on. How was that experience for you, sort of making that decision of giving something up that you knew very well and obviously were very proficient at, and as a hobbyist, even though you sold 2 books and now you're saying, well, I'm going to take the leap and it's a pattern. You didn't know it at the time. There was a lot of.
My wife tells me I'm a whole lot happier as a writer than I was the last several years in industry. And whether that was because industry had changed or I had changed or I was just ready to do something different, who knows? But regardless, I'm happy I made the change. 30 years of doing any one thing is an awful lot.
Yes.
So I'm good with the transition.
Okay. So take me through your process now. I know you mentioned Life and Death on Mars is the newest book, and you are in a very wide and interesting category, primarily sci-fi. And obviously that's sort of stemming from your interests and where there's a lot of interest from readers. What drew you to that category? Was this something that you always grew up dreaming about, working in, space or technology and exploration? How did that transition into being a novelist and a sci-fi novelist?
Well, first, how I got into technology. Uh, I grew up during the first space race. You know, Sputnik, Gagarin, Shepard, Glenn. Those were seminal events as I was growing up, and the that first space race was fascinating. Are we going to have another space race? It seems like there is something of a space race going on to the moon right now, even though there have been some messed up space probe attempts, including one just this week. And I think in today's news, the Japanese were trying to land their own probe on the moon, and they're not sure if it landed, at least the last time I checked the news. But moon races have been done. I was more interested in doing something different. And when my frequent publisher, Arc Manor, approached me and asked if I'd be interested in doing a book about Mars, I said, sure. And I decided to write about a second space race, this time to the red planet, not nearby to the moon. Now, the Russians are in no condition to have a space race these days. So the space race is between the United States and China in my book.
Mm.
I'm pretty sure Xi Jinping noticed what kind of embarrassment it was for the Soviets in the 60s when they wound up forfeiting their space race. So in my near future, no way, no how are the Chinese going to risk forfeiting.
Mm.
To make my story also a little bit different than what we saw in the 60s, I have a third participant in the space race, and that's a cabal of the world's billionaires. Now,
Mm.
I suspect anyone who pays any attention to space or science fiction knows that in the real world, there are a few billionaires out there who have ambitions to set up space colonies and privatize space. So, in Life and Death on Mars, the first part of the book is about a race 3 ways, and it's not leisurely a decade like JFK gave us to get there. Early on in the book, it's revealed that the Chinese have a plan, and they've been keeping their cards close to the vest for a long time. When they declare they're going at the very next launch window, which is less than 2 years away, which
Mm.
makes the race extremely hectic. There is another part of the book dealing with the question of is there life on Mars? Has there ever been life on Mars? What would it mean if there is life on Mars? And that leads to a whole new wrinkle that the first space race certainly didn't have.
Mm.
Okay, that was exactly one long soliloquy. So let me relinquish the mic to you again.
No, that's great, and it opens up a lot of questions about um, the distinction between science and fiction. Obviously, is always a curious one. How far off is science from fiction being written today? What is your estimate of the reality of a Mars landing with humans in that cabin?
Oh, I'm convinced we could do it within the next 10 years. I'm more skeptical that we will do it within that time.
Okay. And why is that?
Well, the first space race turned out to be uh, an artifact of the Cold War. The only reason the United States suddenly poured a lot of money into a space program was because of the embarrassment of Sputnik and Gagarin, and we needed to get our prestige back. Of course, the Russians are in no position to do that. If the Chinese decide to do that, then I can see it happening. But interestingly, the Chinese economy seems to be going into what the economists call a period of secular decline. Their economic growth rates keep falling off. They've had a decline in births for the last 7 years and a decline in total population the last couple of years. Their working age population keeps growing, and they have a huge real estate bubble, bigger than the real estate bubble that blew up in the West in 2008, 2009. So could it happen again? Yes, I think it could, but I suspect it'll be more like 15, 20 years than 10. Even
There's no
though in the book, for
driver.
dramatic purposes, I did it a little sooner.
Okay. So there's no driving purpose for us trying to compete with someone to get there, and there's no social need immediately for us to be out in Mars. But there is a certain, I mean, what's your point of where does Mars get us? We obviously have a lot of challenges here on Earth. Where does Mars get us to solve for that?
Well, scientifically, it would be a fascinating place to go. And obviously, NASA has sent a lot of missions there and continues to do so. The European Space Agency has, Japan more recently has, India recently has, even the United Arab Emirates has a Mars mission in orbit around the neighboring planet. One of the most profound questions we can ask is, are we alone in the universe? Is life on Earth a fluke? One of the more promising places to look for it, and one of the more practical places to look for life, whether extant today or sometime in the past, is on Mars. It's nearby. We've demonstrated we know how to land space probes there. So science is one reason. A second reason is as a species, we have all of our eggs in one very fragile basket. And as the climate continues to degrade, and we don't seem to be as serious as we ought to be about saving ourselves from ourselves, maybe having another planet where we could establish a foothold is a pretty good idea. That's
So
Elon Musk's
yeah.
stated motivation for the SpaceX company that he manages.
So some optionality for the human species. That's really what we're looking at right now.
I consider that a good reason. How many other people consider it a good reason remains to be seen.
Right. So,
and I guess the third reason is humanity, since its inception, has always been an exploring species. From one point in early human history, when the human population of one of the early hominid species was down to a few tens of thousands at the southern tip of Africa during an ice age, look how far we expanded. So at some level, we really like to do that sort of thing.
how much exploration do you think is necessary still here on Earth, looking at potentially ocean exploration, where we've still not fully understood everything that's present on Earth versus exploration on Mars?
Well, they're hardly mutually exclusive. I would be in favor of doing both.
Okay.
And interestingly, there is probably some slight overlap in the technologies that would be relevant. If you wanted to colonize an ocean floor, you would need to have a reasonably self-sufficient biosphere, which is something we have not yet learned to build. It'd be a little easier than building on the moon or Mars because there'd be water right outside the dome, and you could easily electrolyze that to produce oxygen as well as getting water. But it would still be a challenge to build something to survive in that context. If we wanted to explore the oceans that are believed to exist under ice on Jupiter's moon Europa or Saturn's moon Enceladus, the technology to explore a deep ocean on Earth or to explore a deep ocean in one of those moons would be very handy.
Mm.
So there's overlap. I'm in favor of doing both. And we're moving too slowly to do either.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine the interest in sort of doing this research and exploration for you is a fascination of what could be, also more so than what is right now scientifically proven at a certain extent, is it not?
Absolutely. I forget who said it, probably 1,000 people, but science fiction is the genre of what if.
Yeah. And we're living a lot of science fiction now. If we go back 60 years, I mean, the science that we see and the technology that we see today was unheard of. Even this conversation right now is something that you couldn't conceive because you didn't have a television yet. So it's quite interesting to know how fast we've gone, to this extent. How much do you think about the existence of other species, and what is the likelihood that you would ascribe to that?
Okay, by other species, I suspect you mean other intelligences.
Intelligent species, sure.
Yeah, okay. And certainly I wonder about it. I mean, many people do, and certainly science fiction authors do. I won't ascribe a likelihood to it because insufficient data. If you ask my intuition, sure, it's a very big universe that's been around for a very long time. It offends my sense of intuition that it wouldn't have happened ever, any place, in any other time. But can I prove it? Hardly.
Sure.
Evolution is an extremely well established, well validated branch of science.
Mhm.
But evolution only tells us that once life exists, it's pretty persistent and expands into all sorts of ecological niches.
Mm.
What evolution does not say is how does life arise in the first place? And there are theories on that, but unless and until we find an occurrence of life having uh, cropped up independently from what we know, it's pure speculation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, as a scientist, you can't take that part out of you. I'm not a scientist, so I would say it's inconceivable that there is not or has not been that with 100% likelihood. But I'm not a scientist, so I can say that.
Yeah.
Um, let, can
The
we
other
talk?
part of your question, Evan,
Yeah.
was intelligence, and I really only talked about life. There have been literally billions of species that have evolved on Earth over several billion years. Depending how you choose to define intelligence, there's conceivably been as few as one species that's appeared out of that evolutionary process. In terms of advanced tool users, it's certainly the case there's only been one on Earth. So there's one scenario, again, I'm not predicting if it's the case or not, but it may be that no matter how likely life is to crop up in other worlds, intelligence itself and technological intelligence may itself be rare.
Hmm. Interesting. I want to change a little bit of the conversation to the process and the business of being a writer and having published works.
Okay.
How Obviously when you're starting out, you don't have the advances, you don't have all the deals and the knowledge of how we're going to do, but obviously you had 2 books already. How does that work for you as a writer, and what is your process like to write a novel or some other piece of work?
Well, my preference is to have a book under contract before I write it,
Okay.
because if you write anything on spec, it's not certain, even for the most established writer, whether it'll have a home. You might start a book that's in an area that is doing well in the book market when you start, and by the time you finish, it may have been overdone. Does that
Okay.
mean I've never written a book on spec? It does not mean that. Sometimes the muse must be obeyed. Sometimes I'll have an idea and I have to see how it turns out. But as I say, that's not my preference.
Mm.
Since I went full time, almost everything that I've written has found a home sooner or later. But sometimes there's extensive marketing involved.
Mm.
The publishing industry has been in a state of flux as long as I've been in it. Publishing houses have been consolidating endlessly. So in terms of big publishers there of science fiction, there are about 4 out there.
Okay.
It used to be many, many more. And it used to be the case that publishers were in it because they loved writing, they loved literature, they loved books. Uh, Nowadays, it's more of a business, and authors have become somewhat interchangeable. And a lot of established writers, and I'm one of them, have been gravitating more and more to small press, because that's where you find the publishers and editors who still buy books because that's what they love and they're buying what they want to read, not, the 47th vampire novel, because vampires are hot right now.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to take the data and build something off of that outside of just having a pure business or financial model in order to harness that in some way, versus it sounds like part of your process is the muse and having an idea, having an interest, and then sort of directing towards that, which there may not be data for whether or not it's going to be successful up front.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I've seen the consolidation with a lot of people that have written in other categories, not in science fiction, but in a lot of hospitality and a lot of food and beverage and things of that nature as well. And it seems like a lot of that's driven by the consumer behavior, how we're consuming books, which is not the physical form anymore, it's this digital form. So we're shifting to podcasts and short form content, and this insatiable appetite for short form video almost. How do you see that impacting your genre and the books that you write?
Well, one comment is I'm finding there's less and less market for intermediate length science fiction. So there's a market for books. There's a ton of outlets for short stories, fewer and fewer places interested in novelettes and novellas.
Mm.
So I mentioned that since I went full time in 2004, almost everything I've written has eventually found a home.
Yes.
The one exception to that right now is a novelette that my muse made me write about a year ago, which is novelette length, about 13,000 words. And that's the exception. That's the item for which I haven't yet found a home, because it's kind of quirky. I'm confident it will, but
Right.
I have my work cut out for me.
Okay. How much of the promotion do you have to take on yourself, or does your publisher primarily support you with that?
Uh, Mostly I have to do it myself, which has some bearing on why you and I are talking today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I will concede that part of why we're talking today is because my publisher hired a publicist who uh, connected us, but it takes a lot of an author's time these days to do interviews, book signings. Back in the day, I used to do a lot of conventions. I got out of the habit of that during the pandemic.
Yeah. It
But
is the process then for you, you know, if you're working with a publisher, but you have to do a lot of the promotion, what do you find is most effective for you? Are these podcasts effective? I know you mentioned book signings, you're not doing as many. What about digital marketing and sort of amplifying the book's presence in channels where there's discovery of new books, like an Audible or an Amazon? I mean, I would assume Amazon right now is the highest grossing bookseller or reseller in the world. How do you use those channels for promotion?
I also have an MBA, which I had not mentioned. So I've taken marketing classes, and the mantra in marketing is only half of marketing does any good, and the problem is we never know which half.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, you're right that Amazon is the biggest venue for sales, and for science fiction at least, Kindle books
Mm,
are the dominant outlet. There are, literally millions of books on sale or for sale on Amazon, and so getting noticed on Amazon is a challenge. And sometimes things go viral and sometimes things don't. I wish I knew the secret. I don't claim to. And some of my books do much better than others. And I don't always successfully predict ahead of time which will do that. But as long as they keep selling, I suppose I'm in it for the duration.
yeah. So you've had a now 20-year full-time career writing, almost 20 years full-time career writing. What are some lessons learned from, again, that shift into writing full-time and as a full-time writer for the aspiring writer, someone who maybe wants to write, but they haven't picked up the pen and paper yet, proverbially, and they want to go forward? What's some advice you'd have for them?
It's a hard way to make a living. Um, and it works for some people, it doesn't work for others. An awful lot of writers, not just myself, um, made a point of getting established in another career first. And that way there's a fallback. I didn't need to fall back, but if I had chosen to, I would have been able to. I mentioned the sabbatical that I did. And after about um, 20 months doing that, I was able to go back into working in technology.
Got it. What is your sort of plan ahead? I mean, you have a book out now, Life and Death on Mars. Obviously, it explores some really interesting topics that have been very present because of the billionaire class more so than anyone else, and the private space race.
Yeah.
What do the next 20 years look like for you? Where are you going with your writing, and what do you want to explore?
I've been playing around with an alternate history, and it's related to that quirky story I mentioned that has yet to find a home.
Mm.
Um, I really don't want to talk too much about it, but it's got um, a hack writer who works for a scandal sheet and a sort of Kardashian character and first contact.
Mm.
And I think that qualifies as quirky, but time will tell.
Okay, very interesting.
So that's the near term project, and I'm not looking beyond that at the moment.
Okay, yeah, it's fascinating. Where do you see? Obviously, your livelihood depends on people reading. Where do you see consumer behaviors in the next, let's say, 5 years, not too far out? How do you see that shifting with consumers interested in books? I mean, we're seeing books being banned left and right. encyclopedias included in that. Where do you see this all going?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the trend towards book banning. Uh, the trend that you have not brought up is towards series.
Mm,
And I understand that sometimes a story cannot come to a satisfactory conclusion within one book. And I have done a few multi-book arcs, but I'm not a terribly big fan of the open-ended series where the same character basically is doing the same sort of thing for 10, 20, 30 books. Uh, but that does seem to be popular, or people would not be able to sell the 10th, 20th, 30th book in a series.
right.
So that's a trend that I hope goes away, because I get tired of plot ideas and plot arcs much sooner than that. And I hope that uh, that trend goes away.
Yeah.
I
How do
like the standalone novel.
Yeah. How do we inspire the next generation? I have a 2.5 and a 5-year-old almost. How do we, have you ever thought about writing children's science fiction or anything of that nature?
I've considered writing young adults, although I haven't done that yet. And the chief obstacle to me going that way is I'm so much of a techie that one of my motivations in any book I write is that it's satisfying a curiosity itch. It's scratching a curiosity itch. There's some technology I'd like to know more about, and writing a book in which that technology or emergent science plays a role is a pretty good motivation. In theory, I could satisfy my curiosity just by studying something, but I find it uh, very hard to motivate myself to get deep into a topic if it has no application.
Mm,
Once I start digging into some new technology, real or potential, because I'm curious about it and I've gotten fascinated by it, typically I find that my level of interest and how I want to base a story on that is probably deeper than would be appropriate for a YA novel.
yeah. That would
So
make a lot of sense. Mm,
I wrote a book recently. It's the book that came out immediately before Life and Death on Mars, called On the Shoals of Space-Time, where it turned out to be important to pay attention to energy sources available on a near future spaceship, which got me thinking about portable nuclear reactors. And that was a fascinating bit of research.
mm,
Um, I don't know that that would have interested a YA reader. I'm going to talk a little bit about that book because I'm very fond of it.
yeah.
Uh, the premise is that an interstellar cruise ship suffers a near catastrophic accident, and this ship has no one aboard but aliens because there has been no contact with Earth up until now. And this badly injured starship limps to the nearest solar system for uh, resources. Their only hope of rescue is if we primitive humans can somehow help them, which is quite the challenge because they're stranded on the fringes of the solar system, which is where the title comes from. And we primitive humans are barely able to get past low Earth orbit.
Mm, very interesting.
Yeah.
And what is this portable nuclear, reactor or energy source? How viable is that?
Well, it turns out it's quite practical. And doing the research for the book, I wound up actually trading emails for a while with some engineers who are working on such a thing and trying to interest NASA in coughing up some prototype money.
Very interesting. So let me ask you about the sort of biggest piece of technology these days that is attacking what you do, and that's generative AI and just artificial intelligence for authorship. What's your sentiment around that? How can it be a useful tool? What are the concerns you have around it, or do you not? And is that something that you've integrated into your process?
It's nothing that I have used. I've played with it and discovered a couple of unsettling things.
Mm,
First, that several of my books were used without permission as part of the training set for a couple of the AIs.
yeah.
No permission, no compensation. So that's certainly not satisfying. I did some experiments with a couple of the leading AIs to see if what they had to say was trustworthy. And I asked questions for which I certainly knew the answer, like, what are the books written by science fiction author Edward M. Lerner? What awards has he won? Give me a plot summary of one of his books. And I've gotten credit for books I have not written. Other people have gotten credit for books I did write. Uh, I was told I'd won awards I had not. The plot summary started out correct and then veered into the weeds.
Mm,
So this is politely described as these AIs hallucinate. Uh, the lesson is anyone who trusts one of these large language model AIs, trusts what they say without verifying it, is really taking a chance.
yeah.
So far, not a fan. I don't even like the fact that they are called intelligences because they're
Wow.
not. They're advanced autocorrect. The
Mm,
technology works by digesting huge amounts of content, recognizing patterns or thinking it recognizes patterns. And then when you feed a prompt to one of these models, it applies what it thinks it's learned about pattern recognition to predict what you want, just as a form of extrapolation.
mm-hmm.
There is no thought, there is no intelligence as we humans traditionally interpret the word intelligence.
Yeah.
Okay, after having ranted a bit, is it potentially a useful tool? Properly used, yes. And in fact, the technology is applied in On the Shoals of Space-Time as a minor plot point.
Mm, very
It will
interesting.
be interesting to see how it develops in another 5 or 10 years, but I don't think we have yet seen our silicon overlords.
Yeah, hopefully we never do, but I also do hope that they correct for the very inappropriate use of published and owned work to inform and not compensate the people that created those works. I know that's been a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, especially, I'm in Los Angeles, so Hollywood has a bone to pick with that as well. But hopefully that can get resolved. So the latest book is Life and Death on Mars. Where can people find that book, and what else do you want to share with our audience for how to find your work?
Well, all of my books can be found on Amazon, of course. Um, that book is in most bookstores right now. And if you go to a bookstore that does not have it on the shelf, they'll be happy to order it for you. To find out more about me, my authorial website, surprisingly or not, is edwardmlerner.com. I should mention Lerner is spelled Lerner. There's no A in it. Sometimes people want to misspell my name. I'm also Edward M. Lerner on Facebook, on LinkedIn, And my blog is blog.edwardmlerner.com.
Great. Well, really appreciate having you on the show today. It was a very fascinating conversation, and best of luck with the book and the future books as well.
Thanks, Evan. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Adeptus On-Air. If you like this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. The views and opinions by the podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Adeptus. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice.